So I was just suggesting that Middlemarch is kind of a founding document of our form of life. Um, that is form of life based around the values that we experience as individuals, purposes that we pursue as individuals, in the face of a socio historical reality we can sort of define empirically as kind of mix of private purpose and objective socio-historical circumstance. Um, Middlemarch is, a foundational document of that form of life. Um, and I kind of, without trying to force it too much, I just want to, in the spirit of giving you a sense of the roots of Middlemarch, where it's coming from, the kind of conversation maybe it's engaging with other forms of art, literary predecessors. I think a similar thing can be said about Anthony and Cleopatra. It's about the ushering in of this imperial Christianity in the wake of the uh, Roman Republic, the sort of classical ideals um, of uh, Republican ideals, valor in war and, effective of governance. Everything is directed and evaluated um, towards its efficacy in promoting Rome. Um, and this transition, I think, can be mapped. It can be illustrated in terms of the development of Christian art in a way that I think may be helpful in illuminating to see what we're getting into here in Middlemarch. Um, so this Doryphorus, the spear bearer, kind of represents classical ideals um, of a beauty, strength, poise. I think that's what this is about. Self-contained, self-possession, self-contained poise, sort of balance, cocked hip. This beauty that's all possessed within the human body and manifest like a god on earth. This thing is 6 feet 11 inches. I wonder what the average height was at that time. But that's a self-representation. This is like what it means to be a man or the ideal man. Um, but the point is that ideal is possessed, manifest. It's not something that we have faith in. It's something we have and do in our bodies, in the here and now. Um, that manifest uh, um, value and uh, realized self-possessed. I am the realization of my own purpose entirely. I think it's a hard idea for us to wrap our heads around. I think Nietzsche referred to that as a master morality. The the idea that I am my own God. I dictate what's good, and um, Nietzsche talked about it in terms of the difference between good and bad, and on the one hand, and good and evil on the other. The master morality um, things are either good or bad depending on how they affect me. I dictate what's good or bad. I don't need to obey some like code of good and evil. Um, uh, Good and evil um, are the consequence of what Nietzsche called a slave morality, which is to say, with Christianity, Nietzsche wasn't a fan of Christianity um, because he thought it made people valorize weakness. Well, so the way Nietzsche thought about it was that it was the cleverest invention. Like he looks at humans in sort of an evolutionary perspective that is, which is why it makes sense to talk to about him in connection with George Eliot, because as we'll see, evolution and sort of it taking a biological perspective on culture um, is uh, really important for George Eliot too. Um, uh, so Nietzsche saw Christianity as uh, a incredibly clever, subversive invention of a new kind of power that could turned weakness into created a new kind of power out of weakness. Um, it's the most subversive and um, sort of sly, clever in the sense of devious, um, uh, human or animal adaptation in the history of the earth. Um, to have created a way of controlling and affecting your will in the world out of actual weakness. Um, but he says it's so for all its cleverness and such a devious, sly kind of adaptive strategy. Nietzsche says it's turned into a disease that we feed off our own weakness, and it promotes self effacement. And so Nietzsche laments the loss of this master morality that dictates I am my own um, good, and my good is manifest in the world to the extent that I can assert myself in the world. They're one and the same thing. So that's what Nietzsche misses, the old heroic power to realize value materially, effectively in the world. Um, Christianity has sapped it and turned it into this faith, turning the other cheek. Um, so that's just a roundabout way of trying to point out the difference of this heroic um, uh, culture that preceded Christianity. So, how does Christian art demonstrate or communicate the beauty, the power? Nietzsche, again, not as a fan of Christianity, but doesn't have much use for Christian art, but I think is a big part of what's going on with George Eliot. So Christian art, let's look at a couple examples. This is like the convergence of St. Paul on the road to Damascus. So pretty interesting comparison to the Doryphorus, because very physical. The painter Caravaggio is very famous for his realism, very and depiction of bodies, um, extremely rich and evocative depiction of bodies. But this is um, embodied submission, embodied laying in the ground under a horse's foot, embodied mud, embodied waste, um, in subordination to the power of faith. So this shows immaculately strong bodies, um, but um, extremely strong bodies in submission to the even superior strength of faith, the power of the Lord, the revelation that uh, uh, Paul is experiencing here. Um, so what's interesting, what I want you to notice is what I think about in terms of irony, that there's a formal complexity to artwork like this, that the real value that it's expressing or extolling or celebrating is not directly visible. It's this is like a reaction shot in a movie when something dramatic happens and then the camera um, turns to see people's reaction to it. We get a depiction of the thing by how it affects other things around it. Um, so there's a formal complexity to that uh, it, you can talk about as ironic. This is a picture. What we see here is submission, but it's what the painting is actually depicting is the supreme force, the actually sublime force, because you can't see it. It's beyond what could be depicted by directly, materially. So we see it through its effect on the material world. Um, you can see the contrast between the so that the point of the beauty and value here is its manifestation, is the fact, is its physicality, that it's all there. Um, the point of the power value uh, that's depicted here is that you can't see it, that it overpowers the visible material world. Um, so the most familiar example of this, I think, is the Mona Lisa smile, the kind of mystery that withdraws so intangibly withdraws from uh, material appearance, um, evokes this interiority of faith or grace. Um, it's maybe the term ironic makes a little uh, it applies in a more familiar way to this painting. Um, it's sort of a knowing ironic irony to that um, just glimpse of a smile. Um, so I'm trying to suggest the role of sublimity in Christian art, evoking um, what can't be directly positively represented: grace, faith. Another point about irony is that it's communicating by tension. So is in contrast to the Doryphorus, that where it's all positively manifest. This painting is like a mediation between the physical world and the invisible value that the painting is evoking outside itself. It's mediating. The role of mediation is uh, crucial, and the role of imagination, the viewer's imagination, the what makes this painting viewable. I mean, beautiful, or uh, what gives it the um, special saying like more sublime um, quality also has to do with our reaction to it. So the viewer, the um, audience becomes especially important for Sublime um, art because the art is interactive. You you know, like a beautiful flower doesn't need necessarily need the viewer to be beautiful. It's because its beauty is like um, uh, in artic in its structure, um, but this the what makes this special is the way in which we respond to it. Needs a another viewer to it needs a viewer to appreciate the to see that sublime value that can't be directly represented. And that's another the emphasis, the importance of the audience or the viewer or the reader is another way in which uh, in a Christian emphasis on the common man, the common people. Um, this is not a hierarchical art because of its dependence on the viewer. So it's egalitarian in the sense it puts everybody on the same level. Whereas the Doryphorus so obviously is hierarchical. It's 7 feet tall. You have to look up at it uh, worship it. It teaches you a value of beauty. As hierarchical. It puts certain people above others. Um, Whereas this art is this Christian art is leveling. Would, Eliot talks about Saint Teresa, compares Dorothea to this sort of Saint Teresa without being sainted, an anonymous saint. Um, that's one way of thinking about, or I think something that Eliot is inviting us to consider is the viewing the transition from a feudal, aristocratic, hierarchical form of life based on nobility, enchantment, into our modern form of life. We usually think of that as a transition of disenchanting into a secular world where things are demystified, old superstitions, ideas of nobility, underwriting these social hierarchies, are replaced by an enlightened awareness of facts, objective truth, a demystified objective truth, but also likewise an awareness of the objective equality of people and experience. There aren't different castes or level of nobility, for instance. And but what Eliot's suggesting, so that there's a downside to that disenchantment. We It can make life feel empty. That it reduces the world to that view from nowhere. If what counts as real is objective, it's sort of like that's what nobody can actually. That makes everybody's subjective experience kind of false and at least unimportant, like beside the point in terms of truth. Dismissible. Um, but we've already gotten a sense when looking at how Eliot talks about reality as kind of requiring kind of fidelity, an engagement of your soul, and a kind of a musical um, uh, aesthetic beauty. Um, to really perceive reality is, kind of a religious experience for Eliot. So what she's suggesting that I think makes her akin to um, critic of modernity, critic of Christianity, like Friedrich Nietzsche, um, who is famous for saying that God is dead. Um, but that Eliot wants to see this new democratic um, world of equality, the equal public life, egalitarian public life, as enchanted. It, she wants to hold on to the idea of equality and the idea of enchantment together. Um, so that's what I think she's suggesting when she talks about an anonymous Saint Teresa. Talks about Dorothea, her protagonist, as an anonymous Saint Teresa. She's still a saint, but everybody can be a saint. It doesn't. Sainthood no longer is about this kind of um, privilege status or nobility. So value becomes more like about an intimate, private experience, or this revelation. Um, it's it's not a public privilege or honor that's publicly recognized, but something that's privately, anonymously um, experienced. And that's one of the reasons I thought it'd be interesting to take a little bit of a look at Antony and Cleopatra, because that it's that story in Shakespeare is doing something similar. It's tracking a ma- uh, um, massive shift, continental shift in social arrangement from the Roman Republic to this imperial um, kind of decentered world where it's focused on private life, where Cleopatra says it's paltry to be Caesar. What really matters is the personal experience of passion. Individual experience takes priority. Um, over public duty. Your public identity is less important. So Anthony, says that his famous line at the beginning, nobleness of life is to do thus. He embraces Cleopatra. When such a mutual pair and such a twain can do it, in which I bind on pain of punishment the world to wheat, we stand up peerless. So that's it's a affirmation of the individual experience of passion. That just the chemistry between two people is peerless. Like to feel that passion, to feel that takes priority over everything else. That's what nobility is now. And the experience itself of passion, compared to that, it's paltry to be Caesar. And I did notice here also, this is something else that we're going to be talking about a lot. Anthony, when he describes his passion, how does he do it? To do thus. The nobleness of life is to do thus. And then there's a stage direction, embracing Cleopatra. It's an action. It's not something you can define. It's just something you can point to, and do it, and to do it. There's It's sexual. There's a kind of punning sexual wordplay on that. Um, I mean, the twain. These words are kind of acting out the erotic passion that they're also pretending to name, and that's to say that we're dealing with an aesthetics of the sublime. It's what an experience of uh, aesthetic value that scrambles our understanding. So we can't explain it. This is what so in, beauty um, is also an experience of aesthetic value, but we can explain it in terms of harmony, symmetry, beautiful flower, what the pleasure that bearing witness to beauty gives also makes sense in a certain way. The sublime is doesn't make sense. It's usually involves contradictions, pain and pleasure. Um, so the kind of iconic representations of the sublime are storms, massive, overwhelming forces of nature, or passion, um, or infinity. Cleopatra is called infinitely variable. The infinity of passion. It's inexhaustible. Um, so that's how Egypt in general is characterized in the exoticism of the East. Um, is another way in which this play the sublime is evoked in contrast to the orderliness of the Roman Republic. Um, Again, this kind of publicly, explicitly arranged, codified um, society where it's your the meanings are all explicitly articulated. What is good? What makes virtue virtue? It. You can say it. Fighting for your honor, um, and why someone has honor. You can explain it. Um, the the world of Anthony and Cleopatra is becomes organized around the sublimity of love and sexual passion. Even I mean that's also a contrast. Is Octavia, Anthony's marriage to Octavia makes sense. It's it makes political sense. It aligns him with Caesar. It's eminently practical, and that's a an issue that we run into in our lives still. Is like the tension between practicality and love. If your love is also in your self-interest, that kind of undermines the romance, and vice versa. If it's you have to sacrifice your otherwise um, practical priorities for the sake of love, that makes it romantic. Um, so at the beginning, this is played out really clearly. Um, Dorothy has a very kind of puritanical attitude, and that's evoked really clearly in her resistance to the wear her mother's jewelry. Um, and that annoys her sister, because her sister can sense that Dorothy's playing a little holier than thou. So it's what Nietzsche called an transvaluation of value. Dorothea is making, so we have these beautiful jewels, but I'm making my capacity to renounce the jewels, renounce that beauty and that value into a higher value. Um, and that's also what's going on in Anthony and Cleopatra is the advent of Christianity. It's one of the last lines of the play. Noble weakness. Um, there are other ways in which Anthony is likened to Christ in this play, um, and uh, so although he's you know committed to sexual passion, um, that in a larger kind of historical um, perspective, he's given up the social glory of Roman valor for this weakness, nobility and weakness of uh, sacrificing himself for a private passion. Um, and Caesar's say this no grave upon the earth shall clip in it a pair so famous. So he's suggesting there's a new kind of fame and a new kind of social respect for this noble weakness, for this um, nobility that isn't socially powerful or politically or militarily powerful, but weak. But it's privately, it gives a private value, power, and meaning to life. So I think part of what's going on here is Shakes. I mean, there's a political calculation on Octavius Caesar's part that he realizes that Christianity, or the turn to private concerns, private passion, and the private experience of love, it's good for the empire. It's good for making people docile. Um, and that's Nietzsche's account of the rise of Christianity, is that it's politically it served the empire. It created docile subjects by valorizing weakness. Um, uh, but Shakespeare's also talking about this experience of passion and poetry. He's so in a way he's talking about he realizes that his own literature is also at stake here, um, and that's what I want to suggest that is going on in George Eliot as well. She's marching into this new world of modernity, of railroads, mass transportation, and communication. It's no longer the solid, static form of life that had been associated with the provinces. Middlemarch is ushering us into this new world that's no longer the stable, system of life endlessly repeated that feudalism represented, but something way more complex and vague, like she was talking about in terms of, realism that involves a kind of music or transfiguration of one's soul. And her book, her like art, is plays a really crucial role for that reason. This art now, we're dependent on art now to fill individual lives, where society, the kind of objective politics is mocked in Middlemarch. Dorothea's uncle gets into politics, and he's um, kind of a figure of ridicule. Even in the plot, he becomes ridiculed. Um, so this recalls something that Marx says in the Communist Manifesto. It says with the um, rise of the bourgeoisie, the middle class, that this it breaks apart the feudal hierarchy, economy based on aristocratic patronage of serfs, basically. The creation of the middle class, so democracy, and this is what Dorothy wants. She wants to build cottages, elevate and dignify the condition of peasants. Uh, Marx says everything that's solid melts into air. And what he's talking about ideology, that now the world reality isn't enforced top down by Caesar or by the patron, the squire that owns the land, or the king. But with the bourgeoisie, the middle class people, there's reality becomes a consequence of ideology and imagination and literature, and becomes a much vaguer, it melts into air. What reality is how we interpret it. We're really, still dealing with that problem of like social consensus about what counts as true and important. So this is how George Eliot sees her own work, the practice, the convention of reading and writing literature as intervening in the reality, in historical reality. So can't help returning to this gorgeous statue, the idea of everything melting into air. It's so famous for the sort of liquid texture Bernini gives to the marble. It's almost as if here the water caught between the fingers. It's the reality is this is evokes spiritual bliss, sexual bliss, but on a kind of philosophical level, I'm suggesting that it's about reality melting, the outside objective reality melting into the power of subjective experience. This melting is evoked by Anthony. Again, sort of the melting of the old historical norm for reality, the historical configuration, in this case of the Roman Republic, in the case of Middlemarch, the sort of feudal order, melting into new kind of imperial, global form of society, much more sort of cosmopolitan. It's a kind of ethnic and national in desegregation going on in Middlemarch, as well as social, economic desegregation. So Mark Anthony describes that here. It's Act 4, Scene 15. or 14. Um, Sometimes this kind of melting. Sometimes we see a cloud that's dragonish, a vapor sometime like a bear or lion, a towered citadel, a pendant rock, a forked mountain or blue promontory with trees upon it that nod unto the world and mock our eyes with air. Thou hast seen these signs, their black vespers pageants. That which is now a horse, even with the thought, the rack dislimbs and makes it indistinct as water is in water. Again, it's like how when he's referring to his passion or lovemaking with Cleopatra, um, it's to do thus. It can't describe it. It all melts as water and water. The Nile is a key metaphor for how for Egyptian sublimity or like melting. The higher Nilus swells, the more it promises. Um, so the Nile literally kind of melts the land, um, and and brings forth these strange creatures, strange serpents, the crocodile. So this is Act 2, Scene 7. He's at a party and people are asking him to describe all the exotic features of Egypt. What manner of thing is your crocodile? This is another funny sort of water and water, sublime dissolution. We can't of the sublime impotence of the understanding that we can't understand the Egypt and all the that it represents. What manner of thing is your crocodile? It is shaped, sir, like itself, and it is as broad as it hath breadth. It is just so high as it is, and moves with its own organs. It lives by that which nourisheth it, and the elements once out of it, it transmigrates. So again, like that, the noblest is to do thus. The crocodile is what a crocodile is or does. Love, passion is what it is and does. It doesn't submit to abstract, explicit understanding or definition. And the serpent is key metaphor. It's how Cleopatra finally kills herself. Is performs this funny ritual with where she has herself bitten by snakes, and she refers to herself as nursing them. She turns her suicide into a kind of artwork, maybe a claim to fame in itself, and also maybe kind of homage to lovemaking. I mean, to sexual passion. The snake and the story of Adam and Eve. So I mention all that because Cleopatra does come up in Middlemarch. Key scene in Middlemarch takes place by this statue in the Vatican in Rome. And it's compared to Dorothea. And it's also made by Eliot an emblem of kind of historical difference. So she's writing at a time when this statue is known as the Sleeping Ariadne, whereas the novel is set at a time when it was thought to be Cleopatra because of some snake-like jewelry on it. So here's what Eliot writes about it. This is chapter 17. Um, she refers to the reclining Ariadne, then called Cleopatra. Um, so the character Will Ladislaw, the cousin of Casaubon, Dorothea's new husband, asks, what is the portrait of a woman? Your painting and plastic are poor stuff, after all. They perturb and dull conceptions instead of raising them. Language is a finer medium. Language gives fuller image, which is all the better for being vague. Language communicates better for being vague. I think that's a an interesting parallel with the comments that, of Eliot's that we noticed before about the role of comparing voice to music, and realism to a kind of soul-stirring perspective. After all, the true seeing is within, and painting stares at you with an insistent imperfection. I feel that especially about representations of women, as if a woman were a mere colored superficies. You must wait for movement and tone. There's a difference in their very breathing. They change from moment to moment. This woman who you have just seen, for example, how would you paint her voice, pray? But her voice is much diviner than anything you have seen of her. So he's referring to Dorothea. So just as Cleopatra represents the highest nobility, or his passion for Anthony's passion for Cleopatra represents the highest nobility for him. Will Ladislaw says the highest truth is a kind of movement that is sublime movement that is beyond the visual arts to capture entirely, and even beyond language. But Will prefers language, the ability of language, language is a temporal art. It's an art of movement, like music. It takes place in time, whereas visual arts holds movement still. But you can see how, like the ecstasy of Saint Teresa, how the sculpture evokes movement, balance, kind of the fluidity of the garments. And the snake itself, of course, is and eroticism in general. It represents a kind of destabilizing of what we think we understand. And again, so it may seem weird, this correlation of erotic passion with Christian faith, but that's what passion means. Passion means this kind of sublime conjunction of suffering, faith, and pleasure, a kind of higher pleasure that's takes suffering, that makes experience of faith in suffering, that creates a higher pleasure. Anyways, these are all themes that I think are helpful, or I hope are helpful to understanding what's the mood kind of behind Dorothea, what she starts out, with this intense puritanical um, uh, kind of intensely rigid puritanism, um, but underlying it is the sensuality. It comes out already in that scene with the jewelry. She, even as she's renouncing it, she becomes kind of seduced by it unexpectedly. Um, so I think we see already from the beginning. I mean, even that amazing first line, that Dorothea had the kind of beauty that was accentuated by poor dress. Um, that contradiction that what should be poor is actually the richest thing. Um, so I think that's part of Dorothy's the development that we'll be tracing with her, is that what begins as puritanical and a passion directed in the kind of least likely, least plausible direction toward Casaubon, um, is uh, to for Eliot is connected with this intense, again, interaction, this web of contradictory elements involved in Christian faith, and just to underscore that again, that the way Cleopatra describes the snakes is so cool. Uh, she's putting the snakes on her. Come, thou mortal wretch, with thy sharp teeth, this knot intrinsicant of life untie. This knot intrinsicate of life. The ambiguity of the snake is this intrinsicate is itself. It's a smushing together of intricate and intrinsic, and it thereby again acting out a kind of eroticism, a kind of sublime passion that scrambles our familiar concepts of understanding.